Before America's pioneers ventured west along the Oregon Trail, before the Pony Express carried mail between Missouri and California, and more than 65 years before the Golden Spike was laid at Promontory Point, there was the Lewis and Clark expedition. Without the undaunted courage shown by Army Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, there might never have been an Oregon Trail, Pony Express, or the Transcontinental Railroad as history knows them. For it was the Lewis and Clark expedition that paved the way for them all. At the turn of the 19th century, America was a very different place than it is today. All the land west of the Mississippi River was a vast, undiscovered wilderness that President Thomas Jefferson had just bought from France. In 1803, Jefferson decided to send an army expedition west to find out exactly what was out there in the Louisiana Purchase. He wanted to know if the Indian tribes there were friendly, and if there was a northwest passage to the Pacific Ocean, an easy way to cross America by river. It was to become one of the most important scientific explorations in American history, one as difficult then as going to the moon would be more than a century later. This is the remarkable story of the Lewis and Clark expedition.
It was a political adventure, a diplomatic adventure, a geopolitical. It was a scientific, ethnographic, linguistic, you name it.
On February 28, 1803, the U.S. Congress appropriated $2,500 for a small army unit to explore all the land between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. To lead what he called the Corps of Discovery, President Jefferson selected a close friend and military assistant, 28-year-old Meriwether Lewis. Lewis was an Army captain who was an experienced woodsman, a commander the President felt would make the perfect expedition leader. Captain Lewis, however, knew that this assignment was going to be a historic one and felt he needed someone to help him organize the expedition. He chose his former Army commander, 32-year-old William Clark. William Clark was 6 feet tall, had red hair, and a love for geography. The Lewis and Clark expedition was the only American military operation that was ever commissioned with two equal commanders.
Actually, there were not two captains. Lewis was a captain, Clark was a lieutenant. But Lewis wanted Clark to be promoted to captain. When the promotion didn't come through, he didn't tell anybody. So he kept calling Clark captain, and Clark even called himself a captain of the expedition. And from all of the evidence we have in the journals of Lewis and Clark, this was a true co-command. Each man took responsibility. Each was responsible more or less for differing kinds of tasks. There's no evidence in the journals of any disputes, any quarrels between the two. It was a successful leadership in that respect.
Preparing for the monumental journey took a lot of planning. William Clark recruited young woodsmen and soldiers willing to volunteer for the dangerous mission, which could take several years to complete.
They advertised for young, unmarried men with wilderness skills. They wanted people who knew how to use an axe and a saw. They brought a carpenter along. They brought a blacksmith along. They brought people along who didn't have ties that would give them, make them homesick, and then they had skills which they could use in the American West.
While Meriwether Lewis bought the instruments that they would need to help map the unknown wilderness, he also purchased medicine, rifles, hatchets, and knives that the Corps of Discovery would need to survive in an unforgiving land where few white men had ever ventured.
They equipped themselves for a journey of up to 2 years. It actually took longer than 2 years, and so they ran a little short of some of their supplies. But they had to take not only equipment that they would need on the trip, but trading goods and to trade with Native American peoples, some basic food staples, although they expected to live off the land and did on the entire trip. But they took tons and tons of supplies. This is not a few people going out with a knapsack on their backs.
Lewis bought many small trinkets to trade with the Indians along the way. William Clark brought his private servant, a black slave named York, along on the expedition, while Captain Lewis purchased a 160-pound dog named Seaman to accompany him to the Pacific. By the spring of 1804, the Corps of Discovery assembled at the mouth of the Missouri River near St. Louis. The group included 22 soldiers, 3 sergeants, and an interpreter named George Drouillard, who would accompany Lewis and Clark all the way to the Pacific Ocean and back.
I think it took a tremendous amount of courage. I think a little sense of daring do and bravura. I mean, an 18-year-old kid, a chance to go to the Pacific Ocean. But Lewis and Clark weeded out the ones who were just along for the ride and for the sights. And the men they ended up with were hard workers who may have complained about the work they had to do, but it doesn't show up in the journals.
The Lewis and Clark expedition officially began their trek on May 14, 1804. They were to follow the Missouri River west, and at first the going was easy, as they started upriver in a 55-foot-long keelboat and 2 smaller flat-bottom boats called pirogues. But that summer was hot, and soon it took a lot of effort to make their way upstream against the current. Sunken trees, sandbars, collapsing riverbanks, and sudden wind squalls all slowed their progress. One of the sergeants, Charles Floyd, died from a mysterious illness not long after leaving St. Louis. He was buried on a hilltop overlooking the Missouri River. 2 of the volunteer soldiers deserted, and 1 man was discharged for mutiny, and there were floggings for disobeying orders. Almost from the beginning, the expedition turned out to be more difficult than anyone had imagined.
First of all, they didn't have a map. I think most people, even when they see a map of the American West, are daunted by its size and the distances. They didn't have a map. They didn't know exactly how far they had to travel.
As the group traveled into the upper Missouri, they entered the territory of the Teton Sioux, a fierce Native American tribe that was known for attacking white traders. On September 25th, the Sioux tried to stop the expedition's boats, forcing the soldiers into a 3-day standoff. Although outnumbered 3-1, Captain Lewis finally persuaded the Indians to allow the expedition to sail on.
They were incredibly well armed. They had muskets, rifles, pistols, knives. Meriwether Lewis even had an air gun.
All that summer, Captain Lewis cataloged the plants and animals they encountered along the way and used the ship's sextant to take detailed sightings. Captain Clark charted the river's course and mapped the landscape. After 164 days, their progress was still slow. The Corps of Discovery was just 1/3 of the way across the continent, and winter was approaching. As they neared the boundary of known civilization, Captains Lewis and Clark ordered the expedition to make camp near the friendly Mandan Indian villages. They built a fort near a grove of cottonwood trees and named it Fort Mandan. It was a fortunate decision, for on December the 12th, the temperature dropped to 38 below, and the Missouri River froze solid. They spent the next 5 months at Fort Mandan, waiting out the winter and gathering information about the route ahead. The Mandans were especially interested in Captain Clark's servant York. They had never seen a black man, and to the Indians, York was considered powerful medicine. It was at Fort Mandan that the captains hired a French-Canadian trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau as their guide. Charbonneau's wife, a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, spoke the language of the Western Indians, which none of the soldiers understood.
The presence of an Indian woman and her infant son, who was only 2.5 months old when she joined the expedition in the spring of 1805, was another indication that the expedition came in peace. A war party would never have a woman with it.
As soon as the ice blocking the Missouri began to melt in March of 1805, a keelboat loaded with artifacts collected so far headed back to St. Louis. The expedition then continued upriver with 3 new members, Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and their newborn son, Jean-Baptiste. As the group moved on past the Yellowstone River, they saw immense herds of buffalo, elk, deer, and antelope. At one point, grizzly bears charged the men hunting them, and Captain Clark commented that he would rather fight 2 Indians than 1 bear. During one fierce windstorm, a boat carrying important instruments capsized, but Sacagawea saved many of the items as they floated by. By the end of May, the Great Rocky Mountains came into view. The river's current grew stronger, and the soldiers abandoned their paddles and towed the heavy canoes from the shoreline with rawhide ropes. When riverbanks gave way to cliffs, they had to wade in the water, pushing and pulling their boats upstream. In early June, they reached the Great Falls of the Missouri, the most difficult object they had yet encountered on their expedition. It took 31 days of back-breaking labor under a blistering sun to carry the boats and supplies 18 miles around the falls. To help, they attached wheels to the canoes and pushed them overland. By July 26, 1805, they had arrived at a place where the Missouri divided into 3 forks. By the middle of August, they reached a spring in the mountains that Captain Lewis called the most distant fountain of the Missouri. A brook there ran westward, and they realized that they had now crossed the Continental Divide. Just beyond, they could see the towering, snow-covered mountains that lay ahead.
If you stand where Meriwether Lewis stood on the Continental Divide, looking west of the divide for the first time, the view is a classic Rocky Mountain scene of purple mountains receding to the horizon, and that must have just made his stomach turn.
It was a disappointing sight. The towering peaks told them that there was no direct, easy, all-water route to the Pacific. They would now have to abandon their boats and find horses to carry them over the mountains.
The dream of a waterway to the Pacific, a Northwest Passage, had animated explorers ever since Christopher Columbus. And what Lewis and Clark imagined was that the West looked like the East. In the East, it is possible to head up the Potomac River in a nice, easy crossing to the headwaters of the Ohio River. But the Rocky Mountains were not the Appalachian Mountains. They did not consist of a single chain of mountains, but chain after chain after chain of mountains. And in the area up at the headwaters of the Missouri River, the Rocky Mountain chains are some 250 to 300 miles wide. So getting across the mountains, through the mountains, around the mountains, to the other side of the mountain is the chief geographical puzzle that Lewis and Clark experienced.
As they searched for signs of the native Shoshone, who might supply horses, Sacagawea recognized the surroundings. When they made contact with the tribe, she discovered that their chief was her brother. Sacagawea arranged for the captains to buy 29 pack horses and to hire a guide to lead the expedition over the mountains. In spite of the Shoshone's warning that the trail ahead was bad, the expedition headed on anyway, into the mountains.
Unfortunately, they struck Lolo Pass much too late in the season. They had expected to make the crossing of the Rockies in the middle of the summer, but it's already September. It's a much colder and wetter climate then. There were already 2 feet of snow on the ground. The snow covered the trail, which was a Nez Perce Indian trail, so you couldn't follow it very accurately. They got off the trail from time to time. There's no game in the mountains. There's no food. Deer, elk, antelope, all plains animals in those days, even bears.
It turned out to be the worst possible crossing any of them could have imagined. The weather turned very cold, and the group had to climb over trees that had fallen across the trail. Then the Shoshone guide, Old Toby, got lost. Always visible to the west were the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range that still stood between them and the Pacific Ocean. On September 11th, the expedition finally found the Lolo Indian Trail and followed it into the Bitterroot Mountains. It seemed as if the Corps of Discovery was finally on the right track, but nothing they had faced so far could match the next 9 days. First, a freak snowstorm hit. The river froze, and soon it was impossible to move through the dense snowpack. The expedition was stranded. They couldn't hunt for food and eventually had to eat their own pack horses. They wondered if the Lewis and Clark expedition would all die there in the snowy Bitterroots.
So this is an unexpected winter crossing, a long crossing. This is not a half day's easy walk. This is over 100 miles. It took about 13 days to cross the Bitterroot Mountains. As close as the expedition came to starving to death or perishing from malnutrition, overexposure in the elements.
When the snow finally stopped falling, they made their way down the west slope of the mountains. By the time they finally reached the Nez Perce Indian village, the group was half-starved and discouraged, but at least they were all still alive. The Nez Perce gave them salmon, roots, and berries to eat. The native food made the expedition members sick, but it saved their lives.
But the Nez Perce welcomed the expedition because they saw it as a source of commercial goods, trade goods, including weapons that they could use against their enemies and for their own hunts.
Crossing the Bitterroots had been the most difficult part of the expedition so far. Now, all that was left was to float downriver to the Pacific. The junior soldiers hollowed out 5 ponderosa pine trees to make canoes, and on October the 5th, the expedition set out on the final leg of its journey west. It would be downhill now all the way to the Pacific. But this too was no easy trip. The Clearwater River had rapids, and making progress was fast, but risky. Before long, they reached the Snake River, and then on October 16th, the Columbia. After carrying their canoes around some rapids, the expedition finally drifted into the quiet tide waters of the Columbia on November the 2nd, 1805. Their journey to the Pacific was almost over. On November 7th, Captain Clark wrote, "Great joy in camp as we are in view of the ocean, this great Pacific Ocean which we've been so long anxious to see." They had been gone for 554 days. They'd traveled 4,132 miles, made countless experiments, charted the many rivers they'd encountered, and collected specimens all along the way. These explorers were the very first U.S. citizens to experience the Great Plains, to see the daunting peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the first to struggle over them, and the first to reach the Pacific Ocean by land. Now it was a time to celebrate.
I think they were terribly disappointed. First of all, there are no plans in the early stages of the expedition to spend the winter on the Pacific coast. They expected to reach the Pacific and get back in the same season, in the year 1805. They were disappointed too because there were no commercial ships, no American vessels moored in the estuary of the Columbia where they could have traded for some more supplies and maybe sent a copy of their journals home by sea. This was not a pleasant time for the expedition.
Savage winds blew out the ocean. Swells rolled up the river and rain poured down. The group became stranded on the north side of the Columbia River. Soon they voted to cross to the south shore, where the Clatsop Indians indicated there would be elk and deer to hunt. That decision to move camp was the first democratically held American election west of the Rockies, and included both a woman, Sacagawea, and a black man, Captain Clark's servant York.
They arrived to this specific location on the 7th of December. The first couple of days are kind of getting organized, getting hunting parties in, getting elk that they've shot into their encampment. And then on the 9th, they began to clear an area for a fort. On the 11th, they began raising the walls. By the 15th of December, the walls are up. And then at that point, it's a matter of getting the roof on, getting windows cut, getting doors cut, doing all that kind of finish work. And by the 23rd, the captain's quarters is finished enough for them to move in. On the 24th, most of the men move into their quarters. Late that night on Christmas Eve, they are finishing up the daubing and the chinking of the walls. And then early Christmas morning, after their morning awaking of the captains, the rest of the men move in.
It rained every day out there in northwestern Oregon. They didn't like fish, so they ate rancid elk meat every day. So they spent 4 long months cooped up in Fort Clatsop. They took advantage of some of their downtime, the winters of 1804, 1805, 1805, 1806, to stock up and make clothing for the rest of the expedition. They probably went through 5 or 6 different sets of clothing on the way out. Shoes, moccasins, sometimes 3 skins thick.
Part of the business here, for the captains especially, was to write. And they wrote and wrote and wrote. The maps that Captain Clark was working on, he was taking the strip maps that he had done along the route and putting those onto a map that would later be published. Captain Lewis writing about the plants, writing about the animals, writing about the people. Over the course of the expedition, 178 different plants that he wrote about, many of them new to science, 122 animals, many of them new to science.
The president instructed them to keep an accurate journal and description of their findings, and they took those instructions to heart. They were, one historian calls them, the writingest explorers of all time. The journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition fill 12 big volumes in the latest edition, and they're still worth reading.
But even music failed to cheer the mood. The Corps of Discovery was eager to begin their journey home. On March the 23rd, 1806, their experiments and specimens were packed up, loaded in new canoes, and the expedition started back up the Columbia River.
They left a month early. They couldn't wait to get out of there, coming up the Columbia River in spring runoff. Had to wait 2 or 3 weeks with the Nez Perce Indians before the snow cleared in the Bitterroot Mountains enough for them to recross in June of 1806.
By June the 30th, the expedition had crossed the treacherous Bitterroot Mountains, and on September 23rd, they arrived back in St. Louis, where the Lewis and Clark expedition had begun.
What strikes me about the return trip is how quickly they covered that distance. They had spent the better part of 2 years traveling up the Missouri and down the Columbia to the Pacific, and they got home in 6 months. From the time they left the Pacific Ocean till the time they pulled up to the wharf in St. Louis, just about 6 months. They couldn't wait to get home.
They returned to a hero's welcome. Both Captains Lewis and Clark became instant celebrities for successfully leading such a remarkable venture.
They brought back skeletons of animals and even sent a few live animals, magpies and prairie dogs, down the Missouri River before they headed west in 1805. They brought back pressed plants. Some of these hundreds of pressed plants are still in existence. You can see plants that were pressed by Meriwether Lewis and preserved in that way. They brought back elk racks, which are now in Thomas Jefferson's home at Monticello in Virginia. They brought back buffalo hides, all sorts of equipment and specimens from the American West.
Then, shortly after their return, the expedition quietly disbanded, each member going their separate ways. William Clark enjoyed a long and honorable career in St. Louis, where today he lies buried in his family's plot in Bellefontaine Cemetery. Meriwether Lewis would die mysteriously just 3 years after the expedition. Those who were there say that he shot himself at a public roadhouse south of Nashville, Tennessee.
He was a man who had some mental problems, insanity in his family. He had political problems, economic problems, financial problems, was drinking too much at the time. He'd lost the confidence of the national administration. And although there are a few people who still believe that he was murdered while he was making his way back to Washington, D.C. from St. Louis, I think most Lewis and Clark scholars believed, as Jefferson did and as William Clark did, that Meriwether Lewis took his own life.
10 years after the expedition, Captain Clark's servant York was given his freedom. He went into the freighting business in Missouri. Few women in American history are as famous as Sacagawea, the only woman to travel on the expedition. Although she is believed to have died in 1812 at the age of 25, more statues, streams, lakes, landmarks, parks, songs, ballads, and poems honor this young Shoshone woman than any other. Her infant son, Jean-Baptiste, was adopted by William Clark after the expedition. His father, Toussaint Charbonneau, stayed among the Indians as an interpreter.
The Lewis and Clark expedition encountered different Indian tribes, almost 36 different Indian peoples. And I think it's safe to say that the expedition would not have succeeded. It would hardly have gotten off the track had it not been for the friendship and supplies, and above all food, that the expedition was able to acquire from Native Americans. They would have died in the Bitterroot Mountains without the Nez Perce Indians, for example. We sometimes think of the expedition as a group of 33 individuals weathering every sort of hardship, but they had help along the way, and the expedition would not have survived without that Indian aid and assistance. Sacagawea and Toby are the symbols of that kind of help. And so I think we need to look at the other side of the coin as well, and at the Native American peoples whom Lewis and Clark encountered on their trip to the Pacific.
The Lewis and Clark expedition might not have discovered what it had gone looking for in 1804, a northwest water passage across the continent, but it was the greatest adventure of its time. And more importantly, it inspired other men to explore the possibilities of the American West. It would make possible the opening of the Oregon Trail some 40 years later, the establishment of the Pony Express after that, and finally, the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869. For that alone, the Lewis and Clark expedition was a great accomplishment.